Mysterious murders that took place in the sleepy little hamlet of Monkton, just outside the city of Canterbury, in the spring of 1991, have left investigators and armchair detectives across the globe well and truly stumped for the last 30 years. It's a story of two brazen and confident killers cruising around the English countryside in a large, conspicuous American saloon car with fins on the rear, earning themselves the moniker the Cadillac Killers. A mafia-style hit on a 43-year-old construction quantity surveyor with no apparent criminal associations who was shot dead on the front doorstep of his cottage after answering the door late one night, and the subsequent murder of one of the only significant witnesses to the gangland-style execution, the man's 42-year-old girlfriend, who was drugged and then drowned in a bathtub just 9 months later, with a scene expertly staged in an attempt to make her slaying appear as though she had taken her own life. This is a Truly Criminal podcast exclusive. This is the case of the Cadillac Killers. Not a lot usually happens in the quiet little village of Monkton in Kent, England. With a population of a little over 500 people in the 1990s, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's name, and folks would stop and chat as they passed each other in the street, on their way to the small local library or the nearby grocery store. Most of Monkton's residents knew each other quite well due to socialising at Monkton's only surviving pub, the historic White Stag Public House, which is now a restaurant. Most of the children in the area went to the same school as well, Monkton Church of England Primary School, which, as of the writing of this episode, still only has around 100 students or so. A serene and peaceful place, the village was a haven for retirees, especially those with a passion for nature, boasting the nearby 16-acre Monkton Nature Reserve with its thriving and diverse wildlife and rare orchids. You could say that Monkton was quite literally the embodiment of the phrase, close-knit community. Strangers and outsiders passing through were always spotted and noted with a cool kind of curiosity by the locals, and due to this fact, crime tended to be almost non-existent there. That was why what happened to 43-year-old father of one, Alan Leppard, on April Fool's Day in 1991 was as out of character for the area as you could get. With his cheeky grin and charm, Alan Leppard had always been what some of his friends may have called a bit of a ladies' man. Waiting for the papers of his fourth divorce to finally go through that year, and with a string of ex-lovers, Alan probably wouldn't have denied the description. His recent marriage had definitely ended more quickly than the others. Alan's eye had wandered early on, and he ultimately walked out on his new bride, just 7 months after tying the knot. His eye, as well as his heart, had been stolen by 42-year-old divorcee Brenda Long, a fitness enthusiast and accounts manager, who had recently started working part-time in the nearby Whitstable offices of P&B Metal Components, where Alan also occasionally worked too. And despite the fact both of them were already in committed relationships, the pair quickly started up an affair. Brenda's boyfriend at the time was Arthur Hibbert, a bodybuilder and successful car dealer with international ties, and they had been together for the last 12 years. By all accounts, Arthur was madly in love with Brenda, but it is not known how badly he may have reacted once he found out the news of the affair, although it is known the pair did remain close due to Arthur hoping for a reconciliation. Whatever the immediate reactions from their partners or family members might have been, Alan and Brenda were happy and didn't care who knew it. By Christmas of 1990, as snow began to fall over Kent, the pair had made the decision to leave and start afresh somewhere new together. Speaking about their whirlwind relationship, Brenda told British crime investigative series Crime Watch UK in May of 1991, "I spent so long, and I think he did, trying to find the right person, and we felt we found it. Alan was a very kind man, he was very gentle. He wasn't romantic in the sense he'd bring flowers, but he never hid his feelings." They searched all over towns and villages across Kent for the perfect place, and after ringing in the new year, Alan and Brenda decided on Monkton. They signed a lease and moved into a cosy cottage on Monkton Lane, just a minute away from the White Stag pub. They also started making plans for a wedding the following year, Alan's 5th and Brenda's 2nd. The landlord of the White Stag told investigators he had been startled one evening as he prepared to open the pub by a well-dressed middle-aged man in a dark suit and a red necktie, who burst into the pub calling out for Alan Leppard. The man, who wore a gold bracelet and matching gold watch, had piercing eyes and slicked back hair, and he allegedly told the landlord that he'd heard Alan had a drink in the pub often, but didn't elaborate further. The landlord tentatively told the man that no one else was in the pub, and the stranger quickly departed without speaking or buying a drink. Alan, in fact, only lived 2 doors away from the pub, and did drink there often. However, on this particular night, he wouldn't pop in for a drink until much later in the evening. Investigators felt that the man searching for Alan was highly likely to be one of his killers. It is not known if Alan knew about this peculiar incident, or if the landlord had mentioned it to his new regular. If Alan and Brenda did feel threatened or were in danger somehow, they never mentioned it. On that fateful Monday night, Alan spent the day gardening, whilst Brenda had cleaned the cottage. As the sun went down, Alan suggested they go out for a few drinks at the White Stag. However, on this occasion, the usually social Brenda said she was too tired to go, and preferred the idea of watching television. At around 10 o'clock, just as the pair were starting to doze off, there came a hard rapping at the front door, which startled them both awake. Brenda went over to the window to see who it was. They weren't expecting any visitors, so who could be knocking on their door so late at night? Any knock at that time is alarming, to say the least. Brenda glimpsed a couple of well-dressed men standing next to a large car, parked directly outside their cottage. She put on a coat, but by the time she had switched on all the lights and made her way downstairs, the men had got back into their car and driven away. Alan and Brenda shrugged off the incident and got back into bed. But 45 minutes later, the knocking came again. Brenda once more got out of bed to peer out of the window. She could just make out the figures of 2 men. She told Alan she thought they were the same men as before, and it was definitely the same large vehicle. She asked him to go this time to see what they wanted. Alan, annoyed by the late-night disturbance, cursed under his breath, grabbed his coat and quickly went downstairs to find out who these late-night callers were. As soon as he opened the front door and stepped outside, Alan was shot at point-blank range with a 12-gauge shotgun. Brenda said he went out the door and there was an almighty bang and a scream. I went to go outside and I went to the corner of the back of the cottage. Alan came around the corner, and as he came towards me, he must have moved his hands, and I was completely covered in blood. I started screaming. I think he said get in because he was worried for me. He was just a grey colour and he was just going. There was nothing I could do to stop him. Detective Superintendent Nick Biddis, who would gain fame 7 years later for being the detective to bring one of the UK's most notorious criminals, killer and heist man Kenneth Noyd, to justice, and for being friends with the assassinated TV presenter Jill Dando, was put in charge of Alan's already huge murder investigation. Many Moncton residents came forward with descriptions of the large white car and the people in it. One of Alan's neighbours told the authorities he was sitting in his front room at about 8:30, watching television with his mom. He heard what he described as a scuffle outside. He looked outside and saw some boys arguing. He said, "After that I noticed a big American car cruising up the road at a very slow speed, but then it continued to go up and down the road on and off for the next couple of hours." Alan's killers didn't seem to care very much at all about being seen by witnesses, especially in such a noticeable car. They also chose one of the loudest guns to take Alan's life with. Either they were extremely unintelligent criminals, or they knew they wouldn't be in the country after the murder had been committed, which pointed to the fact they may have been hired killers from somewhere outside of the UK. DS Biddis and his team had attempted to find a motive for the killing and had a number of ideas from the offset, but nothing they could pin down. With Alan's reputation with women not being an overly positive one, Biddis immediately investigated the quantity surveyor's past. However, despite many of the women being heartbroken or annoyed by Alan's past actions, none of them hated him enough to want him dead, and were saddened by the news of his murder. His third wife, Patricia, said he was a cheating arsehole, but he didn't deserve to be killed. When I met him, he was living with an older woman 2 doors down. He was a serial cheat. When I was told he'd been murdered, it was an absolute shock. I know he cheated on women, but he didn't deserve that. He deserves justice. Biddis initially also took strong interest in Brenda's ex-boyfriend, Arthur Hibbert. He may have felt as though Alan had stolen Brenda away from him, and it seemed like a very strong motive. But it quickly turned out that Arthur had a strong alibi. He had been witnessed by numerous people lifting weights in a gym 28 miles away. But was it possible he had hired someone else to do the killing for him? DS Biddis theorised that the killing had been a third-party hit job, and as car dealer Arthur had access to all kinds of vehicles, and so could have loaned the Cadillac to the men for the murder, and then had it destroyed after. However, DS Biddis went on to say that third-party murders could be the most difficult to solve. Whoever pulls the trigger probably has no connection with the deceased. Unless you can connect the person who might have the motive with the person who pulled the trigger, that link is very difficult to establish, he said. Biddis believed that Arthur did have the motive and the means to have his love rival assassinated, but Brenda refused to believe it. She argued against the possibility of her ex being involved. Despite Brenda's protests, Arthur was brought in for questioning and interrogated numerous times, but was later released without charge. Investigators had nothing incriminating on him at all, except circumstantial supposition. In fact, the whole case seemed to be raising more questions than the detectives could answer. Why had the killers been so brazen? They had been seen by multiple witnesses in the area and didn't seem to care at all. Why had they used such an outlandishly noticeable car? And what had happened to the vehicle after the fact? Very good photo fits of the men were made up by witnesses, but these proved fruitless too. Even after the national television appeal had garnered almost 1,000 calls and hundreds of tips, detectives had still made no substantial progress in the case, and the public were questioning their abilities. As the weeks turned into months, DS Biddis became good friends with Brenda. He said, "In the 9 months after Alan's death, I regularly updated Brenda on the inquiry, and as a key witness to his murder, we had a duty of care to look after her welfare and safety. She was affable and there wasn't an evil bone in her body. We had no reason to believe that she or Alan were involved in any criminality whatsoever. They were just tragic victims." After Alan's killing, Brenda moved back to Whitstable, the town where she had first met him, and rented a small flat on Cromwell Road. She reconciled with her ex-boyfriend Arthur around this time, and started spending increasingly longer amounts of time with him. And he, by all accounts, would actually be the last known person to see Brenda alive. Brenda spent Christmas Day of 1991 with her sister, and then the following day, Boxing Day, with Arthur. However, when her sister called her to see how the day had gone, she was immediately concerned. She said Brenda sounded like a zombie, very out of it. And just a couple of days later, on December 28th, Brenda was discovered dead in the bathtub in her flat. An empty pill canister was floating in the water with a Christmas card addressed to Alan, telling him how much she missed him on the side. This was next to a glass of gin and tonic. Her body was reportedly discovered by Arthur, who told investigators he had spent the night before with Brenda because she had been very depressed. When he returned the next day and she didn't answer the front door, he climbed into the flat through an open window and found her in the bath. With the contents of the Christmas cards, the empty pill bottle, the alcohol, and the claims she was suffering from depression, it all seemed to be an open and shut case of someone taking their own life, and that was what the authorities had initially assumed her death was. The final, desperate, heartbroken act of a woman in deep mourning. However, when the pathologist Dr. Alexander Gibson noticed suspicious bruising around Brenda's nose and mouth and a strong chemical odour emanating from her body, he investigated further. He found that strong smell was in fact diethyl ether. Brenda had been drugged to the point where she fell unconscious and then drowned. The pathologist reported, "Someone applied the ether to her face by means of a pad without consent. She had been drinking and it is likely she lost consciousness very quickly, possibly in just a few seconds, when the ether was administered. This was a deliberate and violent assault." A verdict of unlawful killing was recorded, and a coroner stated that Brenda's case was one of the strangest and most disturbing cases I have dealt with for some time. Detective Biddis had his suspicions. He said you cannot look at one murder without looking at the other. Brenda Long was a key witness to the Alan Leopard murder that Easter weekend. I never thought she was the sort of person to take her own life. As with Alan's murder, Brenda's on-off lover Arthur was again brought in for questioning, but he was released without charge once more. Just over a week before the inquiry into Brenda's suspicious death, Arthur was found unconscious, slumped over the steering wheel of a Ford Escort, attempting to gas himself with a hosepipe connected to the Ford's exhaust. He was discovered just in time and rushed to hospital, where he was given life-saving treatment. Sources to this day say the car dealer now works for a garage and still resides in Kent. He refuses to speak to members of the press and is reportedly not a person of interest in the investigation of Alan and Brenda's murders. Peaceful Moncton was rocked to its core by the killings, and now 33 years have passed. Kent police still seem as baffled as ever by the now cold case, despite their keenness to solve it. Dave Stevens from the Cold Case Squad in Kent told a reporter on the 20th anniversary of the crimes, 20 years on and we're still no closer to establishing a motive for either murder. We can't say definitely that the two deaths were linked, but there is every chance there is a connection between the two. There was speculation at the time that this could have been a contract-style killing, but there was nothing to suggest that Alan or Brenda had any involvement in criminality. However, Detective Superintendent Biddis, who is now retired, remains hopeful that a case that is so close to his heart will one day be solved. In 2021, he said, "These murders stand out. For one, I have only ever had dealings with 2 murder victims when they were alive. One was Brenda, the other was Jill Dando, who I met on Crime Watch. I still hope that someone might make a call that gives police that golden nugget that gets you somewhere. The whole raison d'etre for me being a police officer was that I could bring people to justice. It would give me immense satisfaction to know that the case might be solved." Detective Chief Inspector Neil Kimber, who is now in charge of the investigation, said that while there was no new update in the case, recent cases have shown that justice can still be served in historic cases such as these. "No case is ever closed," he said. If you or anyone you know has information on this case, no matter how small, please contact either Kent Police or Crime Stoppers.